This video is for 11-2 training. In this training, we will be discussing the Civil Rights Movement. Let's refresh our knowledge by talking about the end of the Civil War. When the Civil War ends, we enter the Reconstruction era. During this time, we see our Civil War amendments, which include the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to African Americans, and the 15th Amendment allowed for African American men to vote. In 1877, the Reconstruction era ends due to a compromise between Democrats and Republicans, which leads us to our post-Reconstruction era, where we begin to see institutionalized racism and the discrimination towards African Americans. Jim Crow or segregation laws pop up in the South, poll taxes and literacy tests are put in place to try and restrict African Americans from voting, and the Ku Klux Klan becomes a dominant group primarily in the South, but also across the country, terrorizing and oppressing and lynching African Americans. In 1896, Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson changed the landscape of America for decades to come. A black man was sitting in a whites-only section in a rail car and he refused to get up. He claimed it violated his 14th Amendment. He was then later arrested, but Plessy took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. Plessy would end up losing this case, and the Supreme Court set the precedent that public accommodations could be used to segregate people based on race as long as they are separate but equal. This is significant because it makes it legal in the United States to segregate by race. This means that bathrooms, movie theaters, water fountains, restaurants, schools, and many other aspects of life could and would be segregated in the United States. Now, that is all of our background information that we're going to cover. We could also talk about the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance, the fighting in World War I and World War II where African Americans served, even though it was a segregated military. But now let's move to the Civil Rights Movement. During the 1950s and the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement takes place. This is a movement for social justice for African Americans as they fight for equality. Hundreds of thousands of Americans across the country mobilized to join the fight. We see mass protests, sit-ins, bus boycotts, assassinations, large gatherings, new legislations, Supreme Court verdicts that change history, violence, and eventually progress. The NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was founded in 1909 to help make change for African Americans. They do not do this with violence, but through legal court challenges. They end up playing large roles in foundational court cases and legislation during the Civil Rights Movement, like Brown v. Board of Education and the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1954, the NAACP challenged the separate but equal principle that had been established in Plessy v. Ferguson. Through the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, the NAACP argued that separate but equal is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court unanimously agreed that separate but equal, in fact, is not equal. This court case overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, and schools began to desegregate. In 1957, when a school in Little Rock, Arkansas, began their gradual desegregation progress, the incoming black students faced massive hostility that caught the attention of the whole country, including the President of the United States, Eisenhower. They would be known as the Little Rock Nine. When the governor of Arkansas refused to act on the violence that the students faced, Eisenhower was forced to send federal troops to protest the students as they entered the school. Even though Brown v. Board of Education overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, it took many years for schools to desegregate and many years more for the country to accept it. In Alabama, a woman named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to get up out of the whites-only section on a bus. African Americans were supposed to sit in the back while white people were supposed to sit in the front. After Rosa Parks is arrested, this sparks the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. helps lead the charge in the boycott. Black Americans in Alabama refused to take the bus to try and hurt them financially since they were the main customers. After a year of boycotting, the segregation on the bus was deemed unconstitutional and they changed the law to where the buses were no longer segregated. In 1963, Martin Luther King stood in front of 250,000 Americans and spoke about a United States where everyone is treated the same. This speech later gets the title of the I Have a Dream speech. The March on Washington took place in Washington, D.C., in front of the Capitol building. People from all over the country came to hear civil rights leaders speak. Even John F. Kennedy endorsed the march after taking some time to convince. The March on Washington showed the country and the world that the fight for civil rights was heavy in many Americans' hearts. JFK was a supporter of the civil rights movement and worked hard to help the fight for equal rights by working on different legislations. In 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald while riding in an open-top convertible. Many people thought his legislation would die, but Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to honor Kennedy, and he pushed forward and he got both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, or ethnic origin in hotels, restaurants, and other places of employment which are connected to the government. This law also worked to speed up the process of the desegregation of schools. The Voting Rights Act ensured that poll taxes and literacy tests would go away to stop restricting African Americans from voting. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Many thought this would end the civil rights movement. Other groups and leaders like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and the NAACP and other civil rights activists still pushed forward for a better society. Over the next couple of decades, more demonstrations and protests take place and more laws get passed, like affirmative action, which is designed to close the inequality gap between white and black people. Still, racism and inequality existed. The civil rights movement led to other movements from other groups of people who felt their rights had been violated as well, like the LGBTQ community, women, Native Americans, and migrant farmers. The civil rights movement was a step in the right direction for everyone, and it still has a lasting impact today.